What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Spark to Fire. I'm your host, Landon Rhodes, and today we have a couple of awesome guests, really interesting characters that have risen to the top of the corporate ladder. They have worked with millionaires, billionaires. They are some very, very interesting people. Today, I've got Kurt and Alfred with me. Thank you guys so much for coming on today.
Hey, nice to be on here. Thanks, Landon.
Thanks for having us.
Very good. Yes, thank you guys. And I'd love to start off by giving you guys a chance to introduce yourselves. Alfred, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about who you are and where you're from?
Sure. So I'm Alfred Levitt. I serve as the president and general counsel of Hugo Enterprises. Hugo is the holding company for the businesses of Joe Ricketts, who founded TD Ameritrade, and with his family owns the Chicago Cubs. I'm a lawyer by training, but in my current role, and one I've held for a long time now, I wear a lot of different hats, and I support Mr. Ricketts both in his business activities and his philanthropic work, which is extensive.
Yes, thank you. Go ahead, Kurt.
Yeah, hi, I'm Kurt Halvorson. I've worked with Mr. Ricketts for over 30 years. Started out in public accounting with Deloitte, and was hired away from there into Ameritrade. Friend of mine who was at Deloitte was in operations at Ameritrade, and came calling one day and said, "How'd you like to join us on the team over here?" So that sounds pretty exciting. So went over and joined Ameritrade. So CPA by education and training, and spent almost 20 years at TD Ameritrade in various management roles. And once I retired from TD Ameritrade 15 years ago, I've done project consulting work in my own sole proprietorship for Mr. Ricketts and others, and have done a lot of project work, costing work, financial work, and diligence work on acquisitions for he and others.
Yeah, and that was a big reason of why I wanted you guys to come on today, is I want to understand what it is like to be surrounded by high net worth individuals, these crazy entrepreneur, go-getter type people that, you're advising on a daily basis and that you worked with for, decades now. So I'd love to understand what it was like when you first met Joe Ricketts and how your life changed from that point forward, because I assume that had to be a really, really important time in your life of when things, you went from being a CPA and doing CPA related work at Deloitte to then joining the TD Ameritrade team, Kurt. So where did you start out when you first got to TD Ameritrade?
Well, let's say it was an interesting transition. The rigors of public accounting are pretty well known. It's kind of a four-walled entity, four-walled environment, a lot of parameters, a lot of rules, et cetera. Made the transition to Ameritrade, and the first day was actually very interesting. I showed up after having interviewed and been hired by Mr. Ricketts and the head of HR. Showed up for work, and sitting in the lobby, which consisted of a bunch of surplus furniture that was purchased at a discount. So none of the furniture in the office matched. Walls were baby blue. We were in an old Masonic temple building in downtown Omaha. And Mr. Ricketts walked by, saw me, and said, "Hey, you are," I said, "Kurt Halvorson." "Yeah, you're starting today, right?" I said, "Yeah." "Oh, follow me." Took me into an office where two other people were working at a desk. And he said, "You guys are going to have to find someplace else to work. This is Kurt Halvorson, and this is his office." He kicked two people out of the office, and they took. One guy had a stack of stock certificates. He was working in what we'd call the securities cage, processing actual physical certificates in those days, back in '87. And he moved, found another place to sit. Joe removed a typewriter from the desk, cleared a bunch of papers off, and said, "Well, here you go. If there's anything in the drawers, find a home for it." So it was a lot of fun. It was quite the transition. At that time, meeting Mr. Ricketts was just, he was, in the interview process, he was this young entrepreneur, had started Ameritrade 12 years prior. And so I knew a little bit about the company. They were actually an Ameritrade client of Deloitte's, Ameritrade was. And so it was a very exciting time. However, within a month after I started there, we had the crash of '87. which today would seem very puny in comparison to what we've experienced the last couple months. But I wondered at that point, 6 weeks into my career, if I'd made a mistake, leaving the comfort and confines of public accounting for this nascent discount brokerage firm that was fledgling firm trying to find its way, doing retail business, clearing trades for other broker dealers around the country. And it was a very exciting time. It was a very crazy time. And it was just completely different than public accounting. It was like the Wild West.
Yeah. And how many people were at TD Ameritrade when you first got there, when he just removed those two people?
I was employee number 125 after they'd been there for 12 years. So it's a very, very small company. We were packed into an office space, so it seemed a lot bigger than it was, but that's just because we had people sitting on top of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to transition over to Alfred here and talk about what it was like. So you went and got your education, passed the bar, and became a lawyer for several different firms. And talk about your early experience before you ran into Mr. Ricketts.
Yeah, so after graduating from law school, I clerked for a federal district court judge in Philadelphia for a couple of years, and then practiced law in New York for a couple of years at a firm called O'Melveny and Myers. I left there in 2000 to join a firm that was called Boyes and Schiller at that point, and it had just become Boyes, Schiller, and Flexner. And it was a law firm that focused specifically on commercial litigation, so companies that are having disputes. And they were focused specifically on cases that were referred to as kind of bet the company cases. So cases where the stakes were enormously high and often extremely interesting sets of issues. And it was while at Boyes Schiller that I did a case for Mr. Ricketts' son, Tom. And Tom is himself an entrepreneur who started a bond underwriting company called In Capital in Chicago. They had a piece of commercial litigation. I worked with him on it. And at the end of it, he said, you should meet my dad. And I said, oh, does he have litigation? Which is what I did. And he said, no, but you two are going to like each other. And Tom has a good sense of people, among other things, and introduced me to Mr. Ricketts at that time. And I started to work with him on a range of different issues while still a partner at Boyes Schiller. And after a couple of years, I said to my wife, boy, this guy is really interesting. He's like kind of just sees the world in such a fundamentally different way than not only I do, but like anyone else I know. And I said, I think I'm going to raise with him the idea of coming to work for him. And my wife said, well, what would you do for him? And I said, I'll talk about it with him. And so I raised with Mr. Ricketts the idea of leaving my firm to come work for him, something that no one at that point would leave my firm. If you had made partner, you were happy, you had a great living, you were doing terrifically interesting work. And Joe said, well, what would you do? I want to make sure that keep you busy. And I said, I have an inherently anxious personality. And so kind of being idle is not in my nature. And I'll do whatever you think for me to do. And if you don't think of anything for me to do, I'm sure I'll be able to kind of keep myself busy. And that was 13 years ago now. So been pretty busy during that time.
You've been busy ever since, right? Very good. So what was like one of your fondest memories since, you're Kurt, you had that's a pretty phenomenal starting date to have somebody walk in, kick two people out, like this is his office now. But what's your guys' fondest memories as you were, entering, working with the Ricketts family?
So I work very, very closely with Mr. Ricketts. It's the nature of my job. And so the idea of kind of pinpointing a specific memory is challenging because my life, frankly, has become so intertwined with Mr. Ricketts and his family that I feel there's a deep personal relationship that transcends sort of the professional relationship. So I have to kind of acknowledge that at the inception. So it's kind of difficult to pick a specific moment. I'll tell you that I think the thematic thing that I would think is most important is how differently I kind of view life as a result of being in Mr. Ricketts' orbit. So one example of that is he is very active in philanthropy and has a number of foundations where he both operates the foundations and underwrites the foundations with tens of billions of dollars to help people in all different areas. So education for underprivileged kids, and art and conservation of animals, all sorts of fascinating and diverse set of philanthropies. But a while back, I went to India with him in connection with Opportunity Education, which is his primary educational philanthropy, where he tries to bring educational opportunity to underprivileged children, with the idea being that a good education is the most powerful tool to lift people out of poverty. And that, coupled with the free enterprise system, is a recipe for really broad and meaningful success. I had never traveled. I traveled. Been to some nice places like Italy and France. I'd never been to like the poorest parts of India and ultimately Africa. And so that experience of being in these truly destitute areas where like kind of the standard of living is unthinkably low was an eye opener for me. And the thing that was the real eye opener was that the people there weren't unhappy. They were kind of joyful. And I said to Mr. Ricketts, who at this point, this guy's a multi-billionaire, he's huffing it through, some pretty tough areas. And I said, boy, these people just seem so happy. How is it that that's possible? And he helped me to realize that, all parents want kids to kind of do better. Everybody wants to kind of improve the world around them. And like the things that make us the same are much more extensive than the things that make us different. So I could rattle off a dozen stories, but for me, that was one of these moments that, but for the fact that I was in the orbit of Mr. Ricketts, I never would have had those blinders come off.
That's great. Yeah, that must have been really interesting too, going to, specifically going to India. And, how long ago was that?
So one of my, I think I might have hit my head when I was skateboarding as a kid. I have a really hard time remembering when stuff happened specifically, but it would have been around 2008 and 2009.
Gotcha. Very good. Kurt, what about you? What's one of your fondest memories of working with Mr. Ricketts?
I would have to say that it was the time we went public in March of '97. Mm-hmm. And I don't say that because that's a liquidity event for entrepreneurs where they realize their dream of bringing their company public, and it's typically a recognition of locked up net worth that's been on paper, and now it's liquid, and it's available for trading and that type of thing. It was two things really, Landon. It was, number one, it was this realization and the culmination of the dream that Mr. Ricketts had, not only for himself, his family, but more broadly, the investment community and, the American markets as a whole. I mean, like Alfred said, he's a gentleman who thinks differently than any of us. And he has, as he will often say, he has a mind that he cannot turn off. He is constantly looking at new ideas, considering new ways of doing things. Like Alfred mentioned, his philanthropy is very broad and deep. It defines who he is, really more so than his business success. But I look at the business side, where I spent the majority of my career. And when we went public, it not only brought security to he and his family, which he longed for, because the early days of Ameritrade, understand, were very scrippy and scrappy, right? I mean, it wasn't like, gold was falling out of the sky from day one when he started the company. There were a lot of bumps in the road and some pretty big chasms that had to be traversed. So for him, it was a great peace of mind for his family on a personal level. But more broadly, what it did was it provided an opportunity for him to give back to the people who had helped him become successful and had helped create this company that had provided jobs for so many people. And I think not only the element of bringing this phenomenal technology and trading platform and disruptive technology to the brokerage industry was satisfying, but for him it was helping other people who had helped make the company successful. So I remember specifically after we went public, I was running our clearing firm, which handles all the back office processing of trades, the banking, the cash flow, et cetera, for the client accounts. And he came to me and he said, Kurt, he goes, I need your help. I said, sure, what are we doing? He said, once we close the public offering, I need you to cut checks from all of these people's accounts for the proceeds from the sale of their shares. And I said, sure. So he was able to distribute 7-figure checks to some of his earliest investors, people, again, who, like Mr. Ricketts, didn't have a lot of money. They entrusted this money to Mr. Ricketts in the plan and the trust that he had a great idea, that he was somebody they could trust. He was a man of values and integrities and morals and ethics who they knew would do the right thing with their money. Even if it wasn't a successful company, they knew that he was the right guy to entrust their funds with. So for me, it was actually a sort of a watershed emotional event at the company when I was able to present these checks to him. He physically walked around the office, and for those friends of his who had perhaps retired from an earlier job and were working at the company for something to do, he physically walked around the company and distributed these checks to these people. And, there was applause in the departments as we recognized these people for their early investment in the company and their participation with Mr. Ricketts. And it was incredibly satisfying. Not only had he provided the safety and security for his family, which we all love for and yearn for and strive to do, but he had helped provide all these opportunities for these employees in the company, and then to be able to reward and provide for those that were closest to him from the earliest days was tremendously satisfying. So I would say that was sort of a watershed event for me to witness and to participate in.
That's the American dream, right?
It is, yeah.
Absolutely. No, that's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. And what was, I got to ask, so you guys have gone now from, working with Mr. Ricketts for a long time, and I'm sure your roles have changed a lot since the first time you got there. What was it like rising within the company of something that's growing that fast, and specifically with, is it Imprimis, correct? Is that how you pronounce it?
Imprimis, yeah.
Imprimis. So with Imprimis and Hugo, two obviously really successful ventures that you guys are at the head of. I'd love to just hear more about like what your day-to-day is a lot more like today, because to my understanding, you guys provide, advisory services, financial operations, a lot of different consultancy to high net worth individuals and small business. Did I get that right?
That's what Imprimis does, yeah. And I'm a sole proprietorship LLC. There's actually another firm, I guess, of similar name in Ohio that has a much broader reach, and I frequently get all these LinkedIn requests from people who think I'm with the larger firm, and it's like, no, I do something different. So
Right.
it's been different for me, as Alfred alluded to, and I would second this. It's become a different relationship with me and Mr. Ricketts over the past 15 years, than the prior, 18 or so. It's become more of a deep friendship. I've obviously got a tremendous loyalty to him, and I would do anything in my power to, take care of his needs, to service whatever he needed taken care of within his businesses or his philanthropic efforts. And I've had a number of tremendous opportunities to help him with projects. He developed a religious retreat called the Cloisters on the Platte, which you're probably familiar with. It's between Omaha and Lincoln off of Interstate 80.
Mm-hmm.
And he had snagged me to be the project manager for that during the entire construction process. So Alfred handled all the legal and business matters side of that, and Alfred and I worked very closely together on that, but I was the boots on the ground to manage the construction of that, and that took about 5 years from start to finish. So that had given me a different perspective into Mr. Ricketts as well. And I think the things that are different as time has progressed, when you're in a corporate environment, you're rising through the ranks, you're focused on getting the job done every day. You're focused on strategic planning. You're focused on budgeting, and sort of life after Ameritrade sort of morphed into this special projects type environment. It was a lot different. The relationship with Mr. Ricketts was different. It was more of a, I would almost say like a peer type relationship. We would exchange ideas, much like Alfred's relationship with him is. We both know that we work for him and work with him, but it's a different relationship. There's a lot more friendship, a lot more personal discussion going on during these types of initiatives and projects and undertakings than there was perhaps during the corporate days.
Yeah, and you guys have obviously proven yourselves, over the years to be, like you said, that deep sense of loyalty and everything that you provided in terms of value to Mr. Ricketts. And I guess my question to you is, to anybody, I'm trying to figure out, more ways we can bring value to the audience that's listening to this is, what advice would you give to somebody that wants to work with obviously just a really impressive company, really impressive people in general. But what advice would you give to them to reach the heights of which you guys have reached within, your personal careers?
I think there's for me, here's the answer to that question, and it has to do with authenticity. So, um, you know, Joe Ricketts in particular and his broader family are people of substantial means now, and that's through decades of hard work and success at Ameritrade and other businesses. Um, and so I think one of the things for me, the first thing is I never lose track of I'm someone who works for wealthy people, and that's different. And there's their money, and then there's the people who work for them and help them to make smart, good choices. I think it's important to know that it's a service business in my case, and my focus is always on how do I provide the highest level of service. That idea for me began when I started at Boy Schiller. And Don Flexner, who was one of the three managing partners, said to me, "It's a service business, and it's not for everyone." And this is, a guy who, at that point, had great, tremendous success, and was at a point in his life where, many people would lose sight of the fact that it's a service business. But the law is a service business. You have clients. You stay up at night worrying about their problems as though it were your problems. So my philosophy in working with Joe Ricketts is, I would argue, and I think this is probably true, Landon, I think I worry about problems that he has more than he worries about the problems sometimes. I think that he has a line where he says, "I can't sleep at night unless I have risk." And what he means by that is not just, kind of foolish risk, but business risk, this idea that he's pursuing, in his case, multiple business ideas at any one time. And that sense that some of them are going to work, some of them are going to fail, doesn't know which is which, I think is invigorating for him. I don't think it's an accident that Kurt and I, you've got a CPA and a lawyer on the phone here. He also surrounds himself by people who, I think internalize stress differently than he does. And I think he's smart enough to know that it takes that sort of constellation of personalities that produce success. And so I would say that I bring sort of the warrior side of the equation to a lot of the decision-making process.
Yeah.
Early in my work for him, coming out of the law firm, I would, he would say something, I'd say, "Oh, we can't do it because of this. We can't do it because of that." And he said something early to me, which was, "Don't tell me the reasons we can't do something, find solutions." And it forced me to kind of think fundamentally differently about what my role should be. So what I would say for your listeners is, be authentic. Don't try to pretend you're something you're not. Don't lose sight of the fact that you're trying to help someone be successful. If you're a lawyer, if you're a CPA, or if you're a business person, and then at the same time, be a problem solver. And it sounds like a cliche, but it's a whole different mindset to be a problem solver. And it's a much more rewarding bit of dopamine in your brain when you can solve a problem than when you can spot a problem.
That's a phenomenal way of explaining that. I love what you said about a constellation of personalities, because if he, for instance, if you've got somebody that's very very risk tolerant, and they just, like you said, can't go to sleep at night unless he's taking risk, that's so counter to what every other person in the world thinks. It's a very rare thing to have somebody that thinks that way, and it's no surprise that you have several different business ventures going on even well after having a successful exit. And that kind of brings me to my next question with you, Alfred, is what specifically do you do at Hugo on a day-to-day basis? And what is it like? What's a day in the life of Alfred Levitt?
So I work remotely, first of all, and before our recent adventures with the coronavirus, traveled a tremendous amount. A big part of my job was just being physically present in different places. But when I wasn't physically present in other places, I would be working from my excellent home office setup. And I think some of the transitions that people are adjusting to right now, they're a little less acute in my world because this is a familiar experience, kind of working from home. So, my work falls into kind of two broad categories, Landon. First is to think strategically. What's all the stuff that we should be thinking about that we're not thinking about? And Mr. Ricketts has phenomenal strengths, not the least of which is his vision for what the future could look like. He is the first to admit that he's not the greatest manager, because management takes a certain level of patience, and patience is not among his virtues. I believe personally that lack of patience, vision, those qualities actually feed into the great success that he and others like him have. I think those qualities sort of are synergistic. I'm a more linear, methodical thinker. So I spend time every day when I wake up and figure out what are kind of the objectives that I want to be focused on for the day. Some of those things are often things that aren't particularly exciting, but they have to get dealt with. Sometimes like managing people, giving people feedback. It's not something that I love to do, but it's a really important thing to develop talent and bring people along in the right kind of way. And then I do a lot of fire chasing too. There's just a lot of executive functioning that has to happen. There are decisions that have to get made. And yeah, I make a joke that I'm good for 3 good decisions every day, and then and 5 mediocre ones, and then after that I'm done. But it's hard to actually make decisions, particularly because you often have to do it with imperfect information. And in the face of imperfect data, having to make decisions that have implications for company success, philanthropic success, it takes a certain leap of faith, which that is a quality that I've gotten better at since I've been in Mr. Ricketts' orbit, is the ability to make decisions based on a set of imperfect data points.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like the decisions you're making don't have any lasting effect either. I mean, you say I'm good for 3 to 5 decisions, but your decisions that you're making are not to go get coffee before or after the meeting. I mean, we're talking serious decisions here.
Sometimes they're serious decisions, but I don't want to in any way overstate my importance. Sometimes, frankly, they're pretty mundane decisions, but I kind of feel like I try to limit the number of mundane decisions that I have to make, because I think it uses up a little bit of that executive functioning each day, and the ability to empower people around you so they can be successful and you can kind of spread that executive functioning across a team is critically important for any organization to be successful.
I love that. Can you go a little bit deeper into your definition of executive functioning? I want to unpack that a little bit further for the listeners, if you could.
So we try to be very intentional in how we approach, let's say, technology at Hugo. And, it's an interesting thing because there's Hugo, which is the holding company for all these businesses, but then there are these operating businesses under Hugo. Each of those operating businesses has its own kind of technology environment, but ultimately has to be able to kind of talk to the accounting systems in the right way. There has to be appropriate cybersecurity that creates safeguards around the organization. And you're trying to think about how that is supposed to be rolled out at each of the operating companies in a way that doesn't create a headwind to business success, but at the same time appropriately balances risks that are in the marketplace. Like there's a 1,000 judgments that go into that. One of the things after leaving kind of a successful law firm and going to work in what's effectively a startup environment, a lot of Hugo's companies are early stage companies. Mm-hmm. I've come to appreciate how incredibly hard it is to be a successful entrepreneur. It's fine to have a great idea, but then you have to have excellent execution. If you have excellent execution, but your idea is not that great, that's not going to work. It really takes kind of excellent execution of a great idea and a certain amount of luck for things to be success. And it's fragile and it takes a long time to be successful. So I feel that if Hugo's doing a good job supporting the operating companies, we're creating a set of conditions that helps the companies to be successful. We're not creating bureaucracy where it's unnecessary, but we are creating bureaucracy where it's incrementally beneficial. And so constantly reevaluating where those judgments should be made and how they should be made. That's part of how I spend my day.
That's really interesting. Thank you for unpacking that a little bit for me. And so speaking to two, what I would consider very successful people here on the podcast, guys, I have a question for you. Do you believe that work-life balance exists kind of on a general plane, or do you think it's completely subjective?
Oh, what a great question. Um, I believe that it does exist, but those lines have become blurred in the technology age of particularly the last 10 to 20 years. Work-life balance for me at Ameritrade was very difficult. Early on in my career, my wife and I determined that my wife would primarily be the caregiver for our daughter, and I would primarily be the breadwinner. So the early days of building Ameritrade with Mr. Ricketts, with a small key management team, took a lot of time. So Mr. Ricketts, worked a lot of hours. The rest of the management team worked a lot of hours, and that continued through virtually my entire career. So fast forward to today, that work-life balance is a little bit different. Like Alfred, I work from a home office. I'm totally service oriented to Mr. Ricketts as well. So, if he calls with a need, I'm there to provide the service. There's no question about who's in charge, and I think it speaks to the skill sets that Alfred and I possess to be in Mr. Ricketts' orbit as long as we have. That we know that he's in charge, and we work to serve him and his needs, and do that as professionally as we can at the highest level that we can. So, I would say that working with and for Mr. Ricketts is no different than any other entrepreneur that the likes of which Alfred described and his characteristics. The lines kind of blur because their needs are different and varied at different times of the day and night. It's not unusual for Alfred and myself to get phone calls at different hours of the day and night for any number of reasons. And some of those, are immediate needs. Some are sort of thought ideas, things to think about, things to get back to him on. Like Alfred said, we can't give him no answers. We have to give him a no answer with a alternate solution. So a lot of those things are why he comes calling to us. And I think that work-life balance is, Mr. Ricketts' work-life balance is work, because that's his hobby. He loves creating. He loves being an entrepreneur. Those lines to him don't exist. He sees work-life as work-life. I mean, his life is his work, mm-hmm. and his work is his life, not to say he doesn't enjoy, pleasure activities and recreation and travel with the family and things of that nature. But those lines do become blurred as an entrepreneur. Your life is your work, and your life is creating, and your life is developing and growing. So, I think those lines have blurred even for me. When you have downtime, you enjoy it, and you do the things that give you joy and pleasure and satisfaction. And, you hope that the times when you're working do the exact same thing.
Exactly. That's a really, really good point. I'm glad you said that at the end, because if you're finding the right thing, from my experience anyway, you guys have all heard the cliche that it doesn't feel like work. And I truly believe that to be true. Alfred, what about you? What do you think? You guys, and the reason I asked this to you guys is because I guarantee when you were younger, I mean, you were at top law firms, you were at Deloitte. I mean, you were hustlers. You were working your butts off, getting to where you are. So I'm curious, even more so, is how did that change for you as you've gone from the early stage of your career to where you are today? Alfred, go ahead.
The Boy Schiller's founding partner, David Boies, was famously quoted in the American Lawyer, which is a big publication for law firms. And he said that the quote that was on the cover was, "Would you rather win or sleep?" And that sort of spoke to the ethos of the firm, kind of, and through kind of efficient markets and self-selection, like Boy Schiller attracted people who had sort of a "would you rather win or sleep" mindset. And I would say that that's certainly my mindset. So I've never really thought about kind of work-life balance in that way. I graduated from Temple Law School, which is a perfectly good law school, but it's not an Ivy League law school. Half my class was still hustling for a job, a couple of months after graduation. And so my view, was always, I was just so grateful that I had a good job, that I just wanted to work my butt off to kind of excel at that job. And I found the harder I worked at the job, the more success I had. And even more important than that, sort of the better about myself I felt. Like I kind of felt the process of working at something that I liked doing was incredibly rewarding. So I would say that hasn't changed to this day. I don't really draw distinctions between weekdays and weekends. With that said, I'm an engaged, guy at home. I, show up for, my kids' stuff, and my wife is generally not pissed at me, but it's a marriage, so sometimes I have to work at a time where she would prefer that I not, but she gets it. Her dad was a lawyer, so understands sort of how that goes. I think there's a perception that like the younger generation, if you will, so I'm 51, just to give you some context, people in their 20s have this sort of greater focus on work-life balance and, aren't as tough as the old generation was. That hasn't been my experience. I think that, I think within every generation, there are some people that have entrepreneurial qualities, and others who don't. There are some people who are super hardworking go-getters, and other people who are more focused on sort of their personal experience. I think that in the current generation, I think that same skew exists. I do believe that if you want to be a founder of a startup and work-life balance is important to you, I think something's going to have to give in that, because startups don't really lend themselves to work-life balance unless, as Kurt so hilariously said, your life is your work, and then you're set up for success. I think that similarly, there's other kind of spaces where you just have to be prepared to hustle really hard for a really long time, much longer than many people, I think, anticipate before your business is going to be successful. And if that's important to you, having that type of success, I think you should go into it eyes wide open.
Yeah, those are great responses to that question. Thank you, guys. And as you guys have gone through your careers, what's a book that absolutely changed your life? Something that was a pivotal book that you read as you were going up.
So the first thing I'll acknowledge is I'm not a big reader. I'm a big audiobook guy, and I say that because I'm never quite sure whether it's fair for me to represent audiobooks as books, but
definitely.
So I love listening to audiobooks, and I love listening to nonfiction business books a lot. I started falling in love with the genre when I at that point read Den of Thieves by James B. Stewart, which is the Michael Milken insider trading scandal. There's a whole genre of books that's fantastic in there. But this is going to sound like absolutely shameless sucking up, and it's not. But I honestly will say that Mr. Ricketts' book, The Harder You Work, The Luckier You Get, being a fly on the wall there to get to listen to that process as he wrote the book, and as he really kind of peeled back the onion on what it was like to be an entrepreneur, the challenges that he faced over decades, the perseverance that was required, what it took to kind of make the business successful, which was really his whole family ultimately kind of pulling for it in the way that was necessary. The book is fantastic, and I would highly recommend it to anyone who hasn't had a chance to read it. And there's a great audio book out of it, I might add, with the epilogue read by Mr. Ricketts himself. But that book has been a really meaningful thing for me personally.
In my career, I didn't have a lot of time to read a lot of books. There's a number of books that I have read, and a lot that I would commend to your readers that would be in the genre of general leadership and business case study type books, and a lot of business nonfiction like Alfred spoke to. But the go-to book for me is actually the best-selling book ever in history, and that's the Bible. A lot of people are surprised, if I would say that, but that's truly the best guidebook you can have for life. I mean, it really addresses how to live. It addresses successful leadership. It addresses really every issue that can present itself. There's a number of excellent leadership books out there, but one thing that I would commend to your listeners is that, don't focus on, sort of the latest best-selling business book or entrepreneurial book or leadership book. At the end of the day, it boils down to a couple of key things to be successful, and nobody's going to have to put those in print for you. If you have high integrity, ethics, values, a work ethic, and a desire to help other people be successful, you'll be successful. And I think I don't want to oversimplify it, but if you have a drive for something, doing something you love and something you want to create or something you want to be great at, those are really the key bases that you need to be successful. I don't think there's one wonder book out there that does it for anybody. The Bible's a guidebook for me, and it's been a great tool my entire life, and continue to rely on it.
That's a great answer. Thank you, Kurt. I'm going to kind of wrap this up a little bit here, guys. I appreciate your time, but I have to ask before we go on with the rest of our day here, what is your advice after working with one of the world's most successful entrepreneurs and becoming extremely successful yourselves? What is your one piece of advice for somebody that is, and you've given a little of advice during this talk anyway, but what's kind of your closing piece of advice for anybody that wants to go into business for themselves, if they want to become an entrepreneur? What's something that you've seen that you just have to have, or some words of wisdom for anybody that's wanting to turn their spark of an idea into, reality?
Kurt, you mind if I go first on this one?
Please.
So my observation is that the world is engineered to give you a lot of negative negative feedback on new ideas, negative feedback on all sorts of things. My observation from working with Mr. Ricketts and through that relationship, being able to kind of see other entrepreneurs, is you have to be incredibly resilient and believe very, very deeply in your idea, because people are going to tell you it's a bad idea. People are going to be like, if it was a good idea, someone else would have done it already. There's 1,000 points of negative feedback you're going to get. But if you have an idea about how you can picture the world as a better place, and how your idea is going to help bring the world to that better place, you got to hang in there and fight for that idea. And if you keep fighting for it, and you're right, and if it is a good idea, it will prevail, because the free enterprise system, and this is me kind of channeling my Joe Ricketts here, to be honest, the free enterprise system is the single most important engine of value creation across the globe. It's raised more people out of poverty. It's created a broader middle class. And while it's not a perfect system and constantly needs to be worked on, the free enterprise system is the best idea we've come up with as a species. And if you are an entrepreneur with that system needs you in it, coming up with new ideas, creating new jobs and opportunity for other people, hang on to your idea and fight for it.
That's excellent advice. Thank you. What about you, Kurt? Any closing words for entrepreneurs?
That's tough to follow Alfred. He was pretty much spot on and very eloquent. I'm going to say it in a little bit more of the vernacular, which is you can't have a fear of failure. So if you have a fear of failure, you're probably not cut out to be an entrepreneur. You cannot fear failing. By failing many times, it will typically adjust, refine, and cultivate new ideas towards success. And like Alfred said, if you truly, truly in your heart of hearts believe in an idea, see how it can function, see how it can better the world, see how it can better some aspect of daily life, of finance, of consumerism, of whatever it might be, then pursue it. But you cannot have the fear of failure. And it's also helpful if you have a lot of capital.
That's great. Coming from the finance guy, right? That's always good to have.
Hey, you got to be pragmatic.
Right. Absolutely. No, guys, I know we're coming to the end of our time here, so I just want to take a second to say thank you to both of you. I really appreciate your time and coming on here and sharing a little bit of what it's like to, work alongside, somebody that's successful as Mr. Ricketts has been, and to see how successful you guys have become just by being, as Alfred said, within his orbit. And, I find this interesting is, it's no accident that you find yourself surrounded with these great people, because successful people tend to hang out with successful people, and that says a lot about you guys and it says a lot about all of you, that watching this thing grow and watching how this is, I mean, the whole empire of the Ricketts family and everything that I've seen and heard and watched happen. It's just really cool to be able to talk to somebody that was there and is helping build it still today as we go on. So thank you so much for your time and attention today. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having us, Landon.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And guys, that's going to do it for this episode of Spark to Fire. As usual, you can find us on Spark to Fire Podcast on Instagram and all social media. And as usual, keep striking.